Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday, and welcome to Community Central. Today, we're going to be talking about governance, specifically governance of the Knative project. But before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping as usual. There is an event chat that you are welcome to use to talk to the other attendees. However, if you want to ask questions of the panelists, and I really encourage you to ask questions of the panelists because we are doing this in order for you to be able to. Please use the Q&A. I will be going ahead and moderating the Q&A, and look at that Q&A panel for other people's questions that you are also interested in and upvote them. We will be taking the most popular questions in that order. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our panel here, who are all Knative project leadership. You actually want to introduce yourselves, guys, just briefly, and what you do in Knative. Matt, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, I'm Matt Moore. I'm currently on the Knative Technical Oversight Committee and one of the folks who started the project now. A couple of years ago while I was at Google. I'm at VMware now. And I mainly focus on the serving area of the project these days.
Hey, Michael?
Hello, I'm Michael Berend. I'm with IBM and responsible there for the technical strategy around serverless, and have been involved almost from the beginning of Knative, and I'm on the steering committee.
Cool. Paul?
Hey, I'm Paul Morey. I lead serverless engineering here at Red Hat, and I represent Red Hat on Knative steering.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to ask a few questions to get things started. Attendees, you can put your questions in the Q&A at any time. Before I get started, to head off one of the most common questions, this session is being recorded. So if you miss part of it, you will have an opportunity put up the video tomorrow to go back and review that. So that said, let's before we get into governance, for anybody who is new to Knative, does one of you want to do a quick, 60-second summary of what Knative is and what you can use it for?
Unless someone else wants to take it, I'll take it.
Go for it. Go for it, man.
Go ahead.
So I would say that the overarching goal of Knative, certainly when we were getting started, was to try and present a serverless style user experience that ran on top of Kubernetes, since Kubernetes is becoming ubiquitous, right? Having a serverless developer experience on top of that platform that runs everywhere. And so we sort of, originally we identified sort of three main areas that there were sort of, felt like there were gaps. One of those spun off and is now a project that you may know as Tecton. And then today, what folks think of as Knative is largely sort of two main pillars. An area we call serving, which handles request-based scaled containerized workloads. And then another area we call eventing, which handles bringing events into our model, distributing those events to consumers, and maybe soon handling how those events actually exit our model into eventing systems.
Cool. Well, this is not a technical session about mechanics of Knative, although we'll see what questions we get from the audience. Instead, we're going to actually talk about the Knative project. So y'all just had a substantial change in how the project is run. Does somebody want to summarize that?
I'll take a stab at that one. So the end result of those changes is basically there's two broad categories. One is that our steering committee is moving from a model where we had folks on the steering committee representing their employers, and without a clear set of rules for how we'll maintain the membership of this committee. And that steering committee is moving toward a model where it is elected, and there will be annual elections. In fact, our first set of elections for steering are going to be held later this year. And that's a pretty significant change. That is, in my opinion, great for open governance in the sense that there's now a very clear pathway for how the committee will be maintained over time, and election-based process. And of course, we're in steering with our community hats on, serving as individuals. The other broad category is that there is now a committee that maintains the trademark for Knative, and you may want to just like brace yourself for the name of this committee. It may shock you. It's called the Trademark Committee, and that is really about maintaining the scope of what the trademark encompasses. So this is when we were having this discussion about the governance matters that we've been working on, it sort of became clear that this was maybe more of a fit situationally for a committee where vendors are represented. And so that will be the nature of that committee. And although it's not elected, every year the Trademark Committee will consider new vendors for a spot on that committee. So whether you're an individual looking to engage with the project and develop, influence and leadership, or you're a vendor that's making a decision about, do we think that there's a clear enough pathway for us to develop influence at the level of the trademark? I would say, and I say this hopefully, that your bases are now covered and that pathway, either of those is clear.
Yeah. Paul, maybe just to add one thing on the Trademark Committee. So, like you said, that didn't exist before. Before, all of the responsibility was with Google only, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's
just wasn't. So, go ahead.
I was going to say the Trademark Committee. It's a new thing by me. Do you know any other project that has something like the Trademark Committee?
No,
I don't personally know of anything like that. No.
Okay, it's going to be really interesting to see how it works out.
Yeah.
So what are they? So what are they in charge of? They're in charge of what the trademark covers.
Correct. Yeah. And so
if I want to do if I want to do Knative T-shirt, do I come to the Trademark Committee or do I come to the Steering Committee?
Well, you first come to me, and I have you can call it a tax, you can call it a levy, but small payment, unmarked bills, and then I will provide you with coordinates.
Yeah,
that's a lie. That's a joke. No, Trademark Committee is the body to approach within the project for questions about, can I make a T-shirt, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and also things like if I want to establish a new subproject for Knative and I want to call it Knative Project X, that is something that has to go through that as well.
And I think the expectation and the way things have been, I don't think this has been set up yet, but I think the way it was sort of structured was that ultimately the Trademark Committee would hopefully delegate certain areas so that there's policies governing it, and you don't have to go to them. They're like, can I make this sticker, right? So certain self-service policies for certain use of the trademark, but for, in order to call it, what was the example we used? Knative teapots, you might have to go to the Trademark Committee, but for certain other areas like, being in the what we currently call the Knative sandbox, I like to call it the Knative bike shed. It might have more relaxed rules where working groups can sort of self-govern to an extent, with oversight from the various governing groups to create new things.
Yeah, and I think what's also important to note is whatever is vetted as official Knative code by the Trademark Committee, that is what, and Paul might keep me honest, but this is what has to pass a certain set of tests. So you only if you pass those tests, then you're allowed to use the Knative term. That's how the trademark is protected, if you will.
That's right. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a really good point. One of the sort of key things that went into how the mark would be protected was this idea of sort of conformance specification and conformance testing to match that specification, so that folks could basically use those conformance tests to ensure that they are, in good standing with respect to their use of the mark. And so conformance is something we've talked about forever, but it's sort of good that there's a body now that has been tasked with carrying that forward and making sure that folks who want to use the mark have guidance around how to run how to run a conformance test and then use the mark.
So we've got committee, and we have this trademark committee, and that's Knative. Is there anything else?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm just trying to give people a picture of governance of Knative.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that feels like a good distinction that came out of some of the conversations we had, especially with the dynamic of like when we were talking about steering versus TOC, do we need both, whatnot, right? So the sort of now three bodies that I think exist at the sort of top level of the project. There's the Trademark Committee that deals with sort of what we've been talking about. There's steering, and I think the most crisp articulation is it deals with this community, the people element of it, and then there's the Technical Oversight Committee, which deals with the sort of technical aspects of the project. And I like that sort of succinct separation of those three. But obviously, we all talk a lot, and nothing. We don't want anything happening in a vacuum. So, but that's the sort of broad strokes.
Okay, so how did this happen? You just had a steering committee meeting last week, and everybody voted to change things?
Not quite.
It was yesterday.
Yes.
So I think this is something that, like, if you followed the Knative project for a while, you'll probably be sort of trying to match the information that we're delivering here to maybe what you had heard last. And I think this is something that's been open in the community for quite a while. I'm pretty sure that Seb from Trigger Mesh had opened in late 2019. I want to say it's community issue 33 to encode the rules for how steering committee will be maintained. And this was also sort of like something that was of great importance to a lot of us on steering to do after we had our first TOC elections earlier this year. But it wasn't quite as easy as you joke about, Josh. We had a number of public steering meetings. I believe it was starting in mid-August, and those went through the end of September, just about. Is that about right, folks?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Okay, and so do we have the new steering committee yet? What's the timeline in this?
Well, we are going to be having the first elections later this year. In fact, Josh, before this, if you remember, you were kind of banging on me about getting some of the details of the elections finalized. That hopefully we'll be able to finalize those this week and begin the call for nominations. But we should exit 2020 with, among other things, a partially elected steering committee, and that will become fully elected in 2021.
Okay.
I was just going
Go
to
ahead,
add,
Matt.
for folks who saw what we did with TOC a few months ago, I think that this will be very similar to that. And like TOC, which is sort of half elected now, will become fully elected next year. Steering's going to follow that same sort of pattern over the next 2 cycles.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a very different question from the audience. Debbie wants to know, is there any chance that one day Knative serving will be integrated into Kubernetes? Because he says, because we put aside the serverless part, just the fact to create a single KN service resource that creates everything else would make our lives easier.
So, I mean, it's a good question. I would say probably not, but I think there's a bunch of reasons. So we are working with various efforts in the upstream community to sort of push upstream, work with upstream efforts to make sure that they are better aligned with what we are doing in serving. So for instance, we have this networking abstraction that allows us to integrate with Istio or Contour, Courier, or half dozen other networking layers, because Kubernetes Ingress v1 was not good enough, right? And so that's actually probably the heaviest dependency on the serving side that exists today. And so, we're working with the Ingress v2 effort to make sure that it aligns with all of the things we need from Kubernetes so that you can, once that lands and once we're integrated with that, you should just be able to install serving without that heavy dependency, and it should just work, right? And so I think we'll try and lower the bar further and further and further by aligning with upstream and integrating with efforts like that upstream. But the other thing that sort of makes my sort of gut reaction no is I think upstream in Kubernetes, they're trying to embrace CRDs as a model for things to exist outside of core and for Kubernetes itself to be less monolithic. And so I think moving Knative serving into something like Kubernetes upstream is actually moving against the current there to some extent. And so that's sort of my take on it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'll plus one what Matt said. Definitely there was a point in the Kubernetes history where I think what was in Kubernetes was sort of more than what we had wanted to be in Kubernetes. So and that is actually one of the main motivations for custom resource definitions being in Kubernetes, that we can have projects that are sort of maybe a higher level. If you think about Kubernetes as like the base, knowing there's a lot under it, of course, but think of Kubernetes as sort of layer 0 or layer 1, depending on what your index initiating preferences are, enabling things to be on top of Kubernetes without requiring full API servers or being directly integrated. There's been a lot of work in Kube to facilitate that kind of thing. So of course the devil's in the details, right? Like when we think about the question of will Knative ever become part of Kube, the answer is probably that's, as Matt said, maybe the opposite of the way that the winds are blowing. But on the other hand, if you look at the details, there's probably individual features that where Kubernetes may evolve some functionality that's currently present in Knative. And the one that comes to mind for me around that is scale to and from zero for the autoscaler. And Matt, you probably know a lot more about that, and Michael, you probably know a lot more about that than I personally do. So it might be good to just kind of examine that case in point a little bit.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, go ahead, Matt.
Okay, so HPA scale to zero. So this is a funny one, and it does come up a lot when this is raised. I think it's a really good thing to add to Kubernetes. I don't know whether it will ever sort of satisfy our needs, sort of the way we do things, because of the need to integrate with the sort of networking layer and buffer requests while things are scaled from zero. So I think it's actually a really good improvement to Kubernetes for sort of pull-based scale from zero. So things like Kata, which I see as very complementary to Knative, doing pull-based autoscaling, where there's a queuing system involved that's already buffered the request, right? And it can observe sort of the metrics on the queue to sort of rehydrate it and hold on to those things while it's brought up from zero by the HPA. But since we're doing push-based autoscaling, I think it would need a bit more integration with, something like kubeproxy or something like that, before we could sort of take full advantage of it. And I don't know that Kubernetes wants to push to integrate some of those components, at least as is. There may be something we can take advantage of under the hood, but I don't know that it will fully replace what we have, is I guess what I'm sort of driving at.
Okay, thanks for that extremely thorough answer. I actually want to get back to some of the governance things. So you're going to start elections hopefully next week. What kind of person in the community should be running for steering committee?
Well, I think the first qualification, and I won't give my exhaustive list, but the first most fundamental qualification is that you want to do the job of steering, and that job is around growing the community and making sure that the community is healthy and maintaining to the extent that is necessary, governance changes around things like steering charter or contributor ladder, that kind of thing. So if you're interested in growing open source communities, that's sort of what I would personally be looking for as someone who's going to vote in that election.
Yeah. Maybe what we can add there as well is not only how you become part of steering committee, but also, like, if you're more on the technical side, how you can engage in the project as well. And there are various opportunities. You can join some of the work groups. There are various roles within the work groups you can fulfill. There is, since you mentioned the ladder of roles, there is the opportunity to become a work group lead, depending on your engagement. So there are also various areas on the technical side where people can engage with in case they are not leaning towards the steering committee side.
And I think I think there's a couple sort of things I wanted to touch on there. So one of the things that's happened in the last year is the introduction of some sort of or less technical roles around sort of managing execution and whatnot of the project that are new and sort of is trying to respect sort of all forms of contribution. And I think that we're still sort of figuring out, and I think this is reflected in some of the election criteria stuff, how, the sorts of contributions and how to sort of measure those contributions for eligibility. But there's an exception process. And so, while we're working out the sort of imperfect selection criteria system for eligibility and whatnot around steering, if it is something folks are interested in, I would encourage use of that exception process for folks who might have an interest in running, because I don't think we have all the answers. Yeah, but as Paul said, I think, wanting to do the job and having, I like the term chopping wood and carrying water, right? There's, I think, a lot of work we can do to grow the community. And so, folks who, are interested in helping us do that, that's the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, and I want to just draw attention to something that Matt said around the exception process. We really do, I think, not just on steering, but just broadly within the project, value all forms of contribution. And we know that some of them are really tough to count, right? And the ones that are countable, sometimes the count it's just a piece of data. It depends on what dimension you put on that data for what it means. So we know that there's no perfect algorithm to deterministically count and weigh contributions. So both, if you're interested in being a candidate, either for TOC or steering, there's an exception process. And if you feel like you should be eligible to vote and our counting stuff doesn't bin you in the eligible column, there's an exception process that allows you to approach the project and say, I would like to be allowed to vote.
And one thing I'll say from that is I just was on the election committee for Kubernetes, which has a similar exception process. And I'd like to encourage, people should make use of that, because we actually ended up granting 100% of the exception requests that we got on Kubernetes.
Nice.
Which was on the one hand good, but it was actually on the other hand bad, because the fact that we didn't turn down a single one means that there were probably people out there who were deserving of an exception who didn't ask.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I want to mention before we get too far afield of exception process is that when we talk about that trademark committee, that the same thing applies also to trademarks, because we know that at the level of vendors that are contributing to the project, it's not always easy to count all those things either. So in the next year, it'll be around this time next year that the trademark committee will consider whether there should be a seat extended to one or more new vendors. There's also an exception process for consideration for the trademark committee. So when we think about developing influence, just know, if you're watching this and you're maybe a decision maker around where your development team's open source spend is going to be, that we don't need to be in the mindset of we need X or Y number of commits. That it is really, and maybe this will be something good to codify in the values if it's not already there. I think it is, but we really do value all different forms of contribution.
So does this mean that you're done with figuring out Knative governance for the next X number of years, or is there still more to do?
Not quite. So we talked about governance, and we did talk about the internal workings of the project. We talked about the trademark committee, and I'll just be the one to describe the 800-pound gorilla that maybe is still in the room, which is that a lot of folks are really interested in having Knative move to be part of a software foundation. And it's easy to, if I think about Ghostbusters, to cross the streams and sort of think about those two things as as one and the same. They're very closely related, of course, but they're different things. And we did not have any change yet in the foundation status of the project. I know that's something that folks are really interested in. So for me personally, that's one thing I'd like to see some movement on over the next year.
Michael, Matt, anything to add there?
Oh, I think Paul captured it well. It is the next big rock that we need to address on the governance side. I think what we are hoping to accomplish with the changes we already made is to open up the doors for more contributions, like make it more appealing for people to contribute, to engage in the community, to grow the community.
And as a plug, if there are still barriers to that, right, I would say reach out to any of us, right? Because I think everything that we have been doing is in an effort to try and identify and remove those barriers wherever we see them existing, both in terms of using the project as a pure downstream consumer, but also contributing, right? And so if there are barriers to that, we want to know. I think the only thing I'd add is sort of letting the paint dry, right? So just, implementing the changes we just made. The PR's been merged, but there's a lot of work to do on sort of digesting that big bite we just took. But, as Paul said, this is a piece. It's the next step on, a path that sort of needs to be walked. Not everything has been fixed, but there's a lot to be implemented from, the piece that just landed. And so I think that's the sort of near-term thing, while, some of the longer-term things are still there. But, like I said, if there are things that should be on the radar with respect to the longer term, which, that first piece that we just landed does not address, please make sure that one of us is aware of it, so that we can, surface it.
Absolutely, and a good way to do that is you can certainly reach out to us individually, but I think that if folks are comfortable, probably the most effective way to get the broadest reach on communicating those kinds of things that may still be encumbrances for you is to create an issue on our Knative/community repo. Would probably be the most effective way to have the broadest reach.
I thought it was Twitter, Paul. No?
Twitter works too. Twitter works too.
Yeah. So that definitely issues is a really good one. If you aren't comfortable, definitely feel free to reach out privately though. And I know I'm happy to surface some of these things, but I'm sure that anyone on steering or TOC would probably be willing to as well if I'm big and scary, but hopefully not.
Yeah. Carlos on chat is also mentioning Slack and office hours.
Yeah, so we are very active on Slack. Slack.knative.dev, I think, has an invite link. If you need an invite and that's not working for some reason, you can DM me on Kubernetes Slack. I'm Matt Moore, no E on both. And we have every Friday on the team calendar, there's a slot where we have sort of an informal sort of office hours where folks can ask questions, socialize a little bit, demo stuff if they have a cool demo they want to show off. But there's usually a good group of folks hanging out on a Zoom call for a couple hours. Unwind before the weekend.
Cool. So any final thoughts on, well, actually, wait, back up before we get to final thoughts. So for other projects who who are at the point where they're going through the change of, hey, their leadership is just their initial set of contributors to actually having a formal governance structure and having elections and stuff. Do you have any advice for other projects on making that transition?
Well, one thing that I think we found very useful is that the Kubernetes procedures are very thoroughly described, and there's a lot of precedent that you can mine in Kube, especially if your project is already in the Kube ecosystem. I think that like our broad community and ecosystem around Kube is one that values open governance a lot, and it's also much more difficult than I personally thought to like make this stuff up. So it's always good to get a nice energetic boost from maybe stages 1 through 3 of the old Saturn V to get you to the point where you got something concrete to examine the merits of. That's not to say that like what works in Kube is going to be a good fit for every project, but I certainly found it very helpful to look at what Kube has done.
Yeah, I think what has also proven out to be a good element is like this new thought about trademark committee separate from steering committee. Before we had it all lumped into one, and that generated complexities in the project setup that made it hard to come to an agreement amongst all parties. And I think this new construct, and like we just said before, it's probably the first project who has a structure like that. But this new construct helped us untangling what was mixed up before and therefore make progress.
Yeah, so I echo the point, both of those good points about sort of the Kube precedent and sort of separating out trademark from steering. I think one thing that I think I'd probably caution a little bit about the Kube precedent is it's a really big project. And so I would say as projects reach the point of needing a certain body or a certain process for things, I would say look at Kubernetes for precedent, and I think that it's widely regarded as doing pretty well there. They don't have everything figured out. Frankly, they have a lot more folks thinking about those problems. They're sort of laying tracks out in front of the train, right? So hopefully by the time your project hits problem X, they will have sort of figured that out and in a way that folks are sort of receptive to. But I think, Knative, I think, probably had heavier governance and process early on than it should have. And then, recently it probably took more effort than it should have to fix some of the things. So I don't know that we're a great example of when to do those things, but I think that, as evidenced by sort of us wanting the same process for steering or a very similar process for steering that we did for TOC, we think that the TOC process was pretty successful. I think we ended up with a great bunch of folks from the community on it. And that has its roots in, I think Kubernetes-based processes. So, big plus one to sort of not reinventing the wheel and looking to Kubernetes processes. They, as Paul said, that the way those things have been documented is just chef's kiss. They're very good. They're very well articulated, and
Yeah, and one thing that comes to mind is that, since it is a lot of work to sort out the details, one of the things that, I think that I probably would have suggested and pushed for that we do that we could have done far earlier is like modular the details, you can if your project's community is aligned on values, like individuals being present rather than you know, vendors sort of interacting, there's no reason that you can't define those values ahead of figuring out every last detail around governance. And I really think that I think that might be more important in certain ways than actually figuring out the details. Is recognizing your values so that they're not ambiguous and people can understand whether, as they approach your project, whether your values are aligned with theirs.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Thanks to everybody in our community that participated in this process of getting to the point we're at now with steering. Like, probably one of the best open source experiences of my life was like seeing how many people thought it was a good use of time to attend our public discussions around this, and I'm personally convinced that that we have a much better outcome due to community participation. So let me just say thanks to everybody that participated. Couldn't have done it without you.
Okay. Michael, Matt, any final thoughts?
Nothing to add. Just a platform.
Yeah, that was well put, Paul. Thank you to everyone. It was, yeah. And, call to action, keep us honest, right? Keep us, pushing towards keeping the project as open as we can possibly make it. That's the goal.
Okay.
Please join us too.
Yes,
if you're thinking about it, please join us.
I was going to say, you can find Knative on Slack, on the web, and also say, keep an eye on communitycentral.tv website for future sessions about organizing community and open source technology, and we will have sessions in the future. And thanks everyone for attending, and thank you very much for the panelists for explaining what's going on with Knative, so everybody can know. For anybody listening now, if you dialed in late, there will be a recording so you can catch the beginning of it. And thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thanks to you, Josh, for hosting this.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Have a great day, everybody.